we're staying at a small guest house at the top of town. Throughout Croatia, sobe, that's rooms for rent in private homes, are a much better value than big hotels.
Za zdravlje.
Na zdravje.
Ours is run by Pero.
Pero, tell me about the war here in Dubrovnik.
Well, it was a very difficult time. So Dubrovnik was under siege for 8 months. So no water, no electricity, no food, medicine, and all the refugees from all those smaller places around, they came in Dubrovnik, hoping they would not dare to do such a thing to Dubrovnik, right?
What happened to this house specifically?
Well, this house was hit by 2 grenades from mortar, right? So this is what I find in my on top of my house. 2 of those explode. So house was hit, no tiles, so I could see the sky. There's no roofs on the house.
And this house?
This house is more than 6 centuries old, and it's in my family more than 200 years. So I took some loans in the bank, and I decided to rent it like a guest house.
So now it's the tourists come back, and you have a good business.
Yes.
And a beautiful house. The quality and the craftsmanship is just beautiful here.
Thank you very much.
So I wanted to say a few things about Pero, who we just met there. First of all, it's really humbling and a rare experience, I think, to talk to somebody in person who has lived through a war. And so to have an opportunity that's something you get in this part of the world that you don't get in a lot of parts of Europe, at least, which is probably a good thing in most cases, but it really helps deepen your understanding of what it's like to actually live through a war, to talk to someone like Pero and to hear his own experiences. So we felt it was very important to share that story. And then coming up later, we're going to hear from somebody on a different side of the conflict and their experience of living through the war. A couple other things I wanted to mention. One is that the way that Rick makes these shows is kind of an interesting. What you just saw was a really genuine conversation, but it was kind of staged. And what Rick likes to do is, when he's filming, or not filming, when he's doing guidebook work, or when he's just traveling around, he's always getting ideas for TV shows, and he'll have a conversation or a little encounter, and he'll think this would be great for TV. And so then a year or two later, he comes back with the film crew, and he'll kind of do almost like a dramatic reenactment of the same conversation. And that's exactly what you just saw there. When I was in this area with Rick a couple years before we filmed, we had that exact conversation with Pero. The only difference was it was pitch black. It was late at night. We had just driven halfway across the country. We were staying at Pero's place, so we showed up late, and we stood in that same room, and Pero offered Rick a glass of walnut grappa, which you saw us drinking at the beginning, and then proceeded to tell his personal story and talk about his house being bombed and picking up the mortar shell. All of that happened exactly as you saw it. It just happened a couple years earlier. So Rick, when he produces the TV show, he knows kind of what he has in mind. And sometimes it involves reenacting something that really happened, which I think is a really interesting way to make TV. And it works really well, as you can see. The other thing I just wanted to say, Pero is one of a lot of wonderful people that we feel really connected to through our work at Rick Steves Europe, that every so often they get their moment in the sun and they kind of get the spotlight and they get to tell their story on television like this. He's one of many, many wonderful Croatians that I've gotten to know over the years working on our guidebooks. And it's such a treat to be able to introduce people like you to people like Pero. And I'll just tell you a little bit more about Pero because he's such an interesting story. So as Rick just heard from Pero, he opened this guest house after the war, and I happened to stumble into his place when I was working on our Croatia book early on, and I could tell it was really great. In fact, I stayed in that room that you saw Rick lying on his bed working on his laptop. I stayed in that same room when I was at Pero's place a year and a half ago. So he's still doing this. In any event, I found this great place, and we told him, hey, we've got this guidebook. I said, I'll put your name in my guidebook. You'll get a lot of Americans coming. And a lot of times, the first time you do that, they say, oh, yeah, whatever. Okay, sure. You have a big popular guidebook, right? But in this case, they said, okay, well, you'll be there. And sure enough, the next year, his phone started ringing off the hook with people like you using our guidebook to stay in Croatia. And I came back to update the book, and he said, look, I can't handle this anymore. He said, there's just too many of them. But I have a friend across the lane who's got some rooms as well. And the friend's name also happens to be Pero. So there's 2 Peros. There's Pero number 1 and Pero number 2. And you can see Pero number 1, who you just met's on the right there, and his across the lane neighbor, Pero number 2, also had some beautiful rooms. So I put Pero number 2 in the book. Pero number 2 started to fill up. And then they had another set of neighbors, Anita and Ivana, who are sisters, who had more rooms. So we put them in the book. And so now there's this little pocket of rooms at the top of this step lane, just from where you're standing on the main drag there. You just walk up the lane. And we've got them all listed in the Rick Steves book and have for many, many years. And I can't even imagine the hundreds, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people who've been able to stay with Pero and their neighbors when they go to Dubrovnik. And it's been fun for me to go back when I update our book every edition and I get to reconnect with Pero. And just on my last visit in a year and a half ago, I was walking up that step lane and sure enough, this was not staged. There were Pero sitting there saying hello. And my favorite moment on this trip, and then I'll go back to the show, I just got a kick out of this. I was talking to Pero number 2, who's the one on the left. That's no indication of their quality as human beings. It's just the order in which they were added to the guidebook. But anyway, I was talking to Pero number 2, and I said, well, I need to check the information on Anita and Ivana. Are they around? And he says, let me know. I don't know for sure. Let me call them. He says, let me call them. And he stepped out into this lane and he put his hands to his mouth and he says, Anita! And sure enough, Anita's head popped out the 3rd story window across the street. And that's just what we love to plug people into in our guidebooks. This idea that there's this very small community of people in Dubrovnik who are all neighbors, and now all of our Rick Steves people get to stay with them when they get to these places. So that's just a little behind the scenes of what it's like to be a part of that universe when you're traveling.